And it does reflect, what actually happened. And when Hearst says at the end, you know, Himmler said that the Jews were going to destroy Germany, I believed him. And this is my war duty, and I carried it out. He was a man without emotion. He accepted the responsibility that he undertook when he acceded to Himmler's order that he convert Auschwitz from a concentration camp into a murder facility. And that's correct. The film is right.
You're at Nuremberg. You're working, obviously, with Justice Jackson. What's your first knowledge that a guy like Rudolf Hearst might be available? How did that happen?
When the reason I was taken on at Nuremberg was because I had had some experience with OSS. This was the Office of Special Services in the United States, and I was placed in charge of the investigation of war crimes in the European theater. So when I joined the staff of Justice Jackson in August 1945, Robert Story was his executive trial counsel, and Bob Story made the assignments to various lawyers or groups of lawyers in various aspects of the case. Since I had been in OSS, he assumed that I knew something about German intelligence. My knowledge was not very great about it, but I did know something about it. So the overall organization in the administration was the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, or the RSHA, Reich Main Security Office. Within that office, we had both intelligence and repressive agencies. We had the Gestapo and we had the SD. The SD was responsible for intelligence inside Germany and outside Germany. The Gestapo was of course, the secret police which arrested people and took them to concentration camps. So Bob Story said, well, Whitney, since you know something about German intelligence, this is going to be your part of the lawsuit. The Gestapo and the SD, which were indicted organizations, and their chief, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and you go ahead and develop that case. And that was my assignment alone. They gave me a little room in the Palace of Justice with the German secretary, a second-hand typewriter, and told me to go to work. So this is quite an assignment for somebody that really didn't know anything about it. And, I went out into Gestapo offices and searched out documents that may have been lying around. We dug up documents out of the ground, in fact, and so on. But anyway, the head of an Einsatzkommando, and the author was a man by the name of Stolliker, and he wrote the letter to Walter Rauff, who was the head of the motor vehicle section of the Gestapo. And in this letter, Stolliker complained about the operation of a gas fan. He said the trouble is the gas comes in too rapidly, and instead of the people, the victims, dying by falling asleep, they suffer agony. And he said something has to be done about this. So when Ohlendorf said that he was the head of Einsatzgruppen D in 1941, I immediately thought of this letter from Stolliker to Walter Rauff, and I asked him this question. I said, well, then, Ohlendorf, how many men, women, and children did your organization kill that year? And of course, Ohlendorf was taken aback because he had no idea that I had any intimation that they were a murder organization. and he responded, 90,000. That was what broke the case. And from that case on, of course, that time on, of course, Ohlendorf was my witness. And that's where we were able to develop how the Einsatzgruppen functioned. And we knew then that the Nazis really did have a murderous policy, which they applied against the Jews and gypsies and others that they wanted to murder in Europe. And consequently, when the British announced, or I heard that the British had captured Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, which we knew was, we had lots of reason to believe it had been a murder center. I immediately asked the British to send Rudolf Höss to Nuremberg, where I might interrogate him. Now, as the film correctly shows, at that time, we had rested our case. We were through. And the defense was putting their case on. Didn't matter, of course. I was going to find out all I could about Rudolf Höss. So I interrogated Rudolf Höss over a period of 3 days. I had an interpreter. Rudolf Höss understood English to some extent, and it was very easy to communicate with him, but of course I had an interpreter. And I went over his whole experience and his whole life, in fact. And after finishing this, I wrote up a draft of an affidavit based absolutely upon what he had told me. And I then submitted the affidavit to him one afternoon. We went over it carefully, made corrections, was retyped and so forth, and he signed the affidavit. Now, in this affidavit, as the film correctly shows, Rudolf Höss said that he had been assigned, he of course had served in Dachau and Sachsenhausen, and then he had been given the task of setting up a new concentration camp after the Germans had invaded, or were going to invade Russia, at a Polish town by the name of Auschwitz. And this town's name was changed to the German town of Auschwitz. And Höss's function at that time was to establish this town, this facility, to mainly take care of Russian prisoners of war. That was the idea of it. And they brought inmates from other concentration camps in Germany, and they built the buildings in Auschwitz to provide this facility. But in May 1941, Rudolf Höss was amazed to receive a call from Heinrich Himmler in Berlin. Now, Himmler was second only to Adolf Hitler in the area of the administration of concentration camps. He was the head of the German police system and the SS. Now, the German police system was part of the state administration. The SS was extra state. The SS functioned outside the state, and it was a paramilitary organization and responsible exclusively to Heinrich Himmler. So Himmler had both positions, the position of head of the police administration of the Nazi regime. That included the SD, which was the Espionage Center, and the Gestapo, and also the SS. So Höss told me that he went to Berlin and was ushered into the presence of Heinrich Himmler, which would be comparable, of course, perhaps to be, for any one of us to be invited to the Washington, D.C. to talk to the Vice President of the United States. I mean, this is what we're talking about. And Himmler talked to him directly. And he said, Himmler told me that along with the war against the Soviet Union and the other countries, Germany was fighting a secondary war. And he said, this is the war against the Jews. And he said, if we do not win this war, the Jews will destroy Germany. Now, Rudolf Hess actually believed this. He actually believed this nonsense. And Himmler said, your task now is to go back to Auschwitz and to convert it into an extermination center. He said, you won't have any responsibility of selecting the victims at all. That will be the function of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was the head of Amt 4B of the Gestapo, and his responsibility was to go into the occupied territories, round up the Jews, put them on the cattle cars, and send them to Auschwitz. And Hirsch's responsibility was to provide facilities for those who were able to work. No, at that time, his responsibility was to exterminate them all. That was it. So Hirsch returned to Auschwitz and began the construction of the crematoria and the gassing facilities, which were subsequently put into operation. In the beginning, he didn't have these facilities, and he didn't know exactly the best way to exterminate huge numbers of people. Shooting them was not a very efficient way to do it. And so he went to other camps which had been were being started or planned, and including Treblinka, which later came into operation, and he ascertained that these other people who were responsible for killing Jews and others were using carbon monoxide gas. That they would set up a vehicle outside the room, the gassing chamber, and start the engines, and that would bring carbon monoxide gas into the room, which would sealed off, and the people would die. And this was all right, he thought, but he was facing the problem of exterminating large numbers of people, thousands of people maybe at a time. And this didn't seem to be a very efficient way to carry out the executions. So whether he had the idea or somebody in his staff, they had a gas that they used in concentration camps called Cyclone B. Cyclone B gas was used to kill vermin, keep the camp clean. And it was very effective. It really did kill the vermin. And somebody got the idea, well, I wonder if this Cyclone B gas could be used to kill human beings. So I said, well, we'll try it out. So at the main camp at Auschwitz, Building D, I was there, they decided that they would test this out on some Soviet prisoners of war. They got a group of about 600 prisoners and put them in the basement of Building D and sealed off all the windows and everything. And then they put in a quantity of this prussic acid, Cyclone B gas, and overnight, and came back in the morning and see what happened. Well, practically everybody had been killed. Not everybody, but that established the efficiency of Cyclone B gas. All it had to do was maybe use a little bit more of it. And so the decision was made that in the coming killing of the Jews, this would be done mainly by gassing. And this was a good system because they could bring the victims to a room and convince them that they were going to be bathed, take their showers and so forth. And then when they were unsuspecting of it, put the Cyclone B gas into the room and gas the people. But now the other problem was disposing of the bodies. There were going to be thousands and thousands of bodies. How do you do this? You can burn the bodies in the dig trenches and burn the bodies and then cover them over with dirt and so forth, but that's not a very efficient way of operating. So they conceived the idea of building these huge crematories. Now these could be associated with the gas chambers. That's the big advantage of it. So you have the gas chamber down below where the people would be gassed to death, and then after they're dead, you bring their bodies up in elevators to a room where they have a series of furnaces and simply cremate them. Now that's a way to do things. So this is what Hearst decided that they would do. Initially, the first ones that were gassed at Auschwitz were in a small facility at Auschwitz proper. But then they had a couple of cottages on the property that they converted into extermination facilities where people were taken from the trains and taken to these cottages, and gas was thrown into the cottages in the room, sealed room, and then bodies were burned out, carried outside and burned. If anybody suspected that he was going to be gassed in one of these rooms, he was simply taken out and back and shot. So he didn't disturb the others. But after 1941, 1942, the crematories were being built, and certainly in 1943 everything was in full operation. It was a very efficient way of killing hundreds of thousands of people. Now, if you can imagine, to have that task is a rather grave one. How would you go about killing all the people of this city in a period of 2 or 3 months? Well, we're not talking about the people in this room. We're talking about the entire population of Jamestown. Well, it was worked out. The trains brought the victims to Birkenau, which was established about 2 kilometers from Auschwitz. And the victims came out of the cattle cars. Many of them were already dead anyway. And a selection was made initially until after 1943, the selection was made. Prior to 1943, everybody was killed. But after 1943, Himmler made the decision that since Germany was doing poorly in the war and needed manpower, that these Jewish people should be enslaved, that were able to work. And of course, they'd work them until they couldn't work anymore, then they would exterminate them. So they had to make a selection when the cars came in as to those who were able to work. They went to the left, and those who were not able to work were sent directly to the extermination facility. Well, this meant that most of the children, of course, and their mothers, the women, were killed directly. The men who could work, they went into the camps. And many women did too, were able to work. Now, after they were in the camp in Auschwitz, if they were unable to work any longer, they became sick and so forth. Of course, they were then consigned to the crematories. And they all knew it. Everybody knew what this flame meant, shining into the sky at night. So this was the creation of Rudolf Hearst, and one wonders how he could possibly live with himself or speak to me as an individual and say, I did this. And his conscience is clear now. Now, what is wrong with man that he can accept this unbelievable atrocity? After I took his affidavit and...
Let me just
yes.
set the scene. You are brought into a room, and Rudolf Hirsch is there for this interrogation.
Right.
You knew something about him before he came in there.
Well, I knew something about, yes, I knew that he was a commandant of Auschwitz. I did not know his history, really. But yes, I knew something about him, of course.
During the course of the interrogation, some information is set forth about the numbers that were recited, the 2.5 million.
Well, I can tell you exactly how that happened. The 2.5 million naturally, the big question that I asked first, well, how many people were killed at Auschwitz? And he said, 2.5 million. Now, he told me that. I said, well, now, Hirsch, the conditions at Auschwitz were terrible. People were starving, many of them. Many others died. Now, how many died? I'm not talking about those who were sent to the crematory. How many died just from natural causes? Well, he said maybe another 500,000. So that gave me the figure of 3 million, which I put into the affidavit. And so that was it, and that where the 3 million figure came into.
What's your reaction? You hear that number. That is just, you can't comprehend it.
Well, are you a lawyer? All right. When you're a lawyer, you have to set aside your emotions at that point, don't you? When you interrogate a witness, no matter what he says, you're trying to get the truth. And this is very important. To get this figure out of Rudolf Hirsch was perhaps the most significant thing of the whole trial with respect to the Holocaust. So, you just have to put that out. Now I'm emotional about it. At that time, I wasn't. I was trying to get the facts. I was happy that he told me 2.5 million, because I could put that down in the affidavit and have him sign his name to it. Now, the big problem was we had rested our case. How were we going to get this affidavit into the record? And this was no doubt the most significant single piece of evidence with respect to the Holocaust in the whole trial. Of course, we'd have got an end, one way or another. Well, Kaufmann, was a very fine German lawyer, was the attorney for Ernst Kaltenbrunner. And of course, we had to turn the affidavit over to Kaufmann. We turned everything over. This trial was very open. Defense counsel had access to all the information that we had. I turned the affidavit over to Kaufmann. Kaufmann read the affidavit. Kaufmann's defense of Ernst Kaltenbrunner was this. He said Kaltenbrunner had succeeded Heinrich in December 1943, as head of the RSHA, which is the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. And he said that when Himmler made the assignment, Himmler told Kaltenbrunner, now Kaltenbrunner, though you're head of the RSHA, you are only to be responsible for the intelligence facilities, OMP3 and OMP6. You are not to have anything to do with the Gestapo. He said, that is the function, or the concentration camps. He said, that will be the function of what is the name? I can't remember. Anyway, your responsibility will be only intelligence. So Kaufmann, of course, talked to Hirsch, and he found out and Kaufmann had found out from Kaltenbrunner that Kaltenbrunner had never visited Auschwitz concentration camp, never set foot inside the camp. So he conceived that Hearst, and he had never talked to Hearst. He'd never given any orders to Hearst. Hearst got his orders from Himmler. So Kaufman said to himself, now they have the worst witness in the whole trial, but he will establish that that Kaltenbrunner had never been at Auschwitz, that Kaltenbrunner had never given him any direct instructions. So Kaufman called Rudolf Hearst to the stand as a witness for the defense. This is the most unbelievable thing that ever happened. And what did Kaufman do? He took my affidavit, and without making any reference to it, he asked question after question on the basis of my affidavit, and Hearst responded, of course, positively to every single question. So we won our case by the testimony of Rudolf Hearst by his own attorney. And of course, Kaufman was not defending Rudolf Hearst. He was defending Kaltenbrunner. And he said, "Did Kaltenbrunner ever give you any instructions?" Well, no direct instruction. Did you ever, Kaltenbrunner ever come to Auschwitz to observe the facilities, the extermination? Himmler had come there to see these crematoria and so on, how they operated. Kaltenbrunner never did this. So this, in Kaufman's mind, confirmed the defense that he had devised for Ernst Kaltenbrunner, that Kaltenbrunner was only responsible for matters of intelligence and not at all for matters of the establishment of extermination facilities. When he finished, then Colonel Amon, who was the head of our interrogation section, took my affidavit and he read the section by section of the affidavit to Rudolf Hearst, and he said, "Rudolf Hearst, did you sign that?" And Rudolf Hearst, in every sense, said yes. There never was any question about anything. No controversy. So this is the clearest evidence that could be established in any lawsuit of the criminality of the accused. Now, when we finished the case with Rudolf Hearst, he, of course, was obviously going to have to be a defendant. But an agreement had been reached by President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill and Stalin at the Moscow Conference in 1943 that those German defendants whose crimes had been committed in occupied territories would be returned to those territories for trial and punishment by the countries in which they had committed their crimes. So, of course, Rudolf Hearst's crime was committed in Poland. Therefore, at the end of our trial, the Poles requested that we turn Rudolf Hess over to them for trial, and we naturally agreed to do so since we were committed to that under the Moscow Agreement. And do you want me to say anything about what happened there in Poland? Rudolf Hearst then, we turned him over to Poland, and he was brought to trial by Polish authorities, by the Supreme Court of Poland, on 11 to 29 March 1947. March 1947. The presiding judge was Judge Einer, and the prosecutor was a man by the name of Cyprinian. Now, this funny thing, this is very interesting. the defense counsel for Rudolf Höss for the trial of his life before the Supreme Court of Poland was a man by the name of Auschwitz. This was the crime of Auschwitz. Isn't that interesting? Not spelled the same. It's spelled O-S-T-S-S-H-E-W-I-T-Z, as I remember. But his defense counsel was Auschwitz, and he was convicted for the crime of being commander of the extermination center of Auschwitz. So he was brought to trial under a decree of August 31, 1944, for the punishment of fascist Hitlerite criminals. Naturally, the confession which he had given to me in Nuremberg was the key piece of evidence that they introduced in the Warsaw trial. But there were other witnesses and there was other evidence. Rudolf Höss was convicted, of course, of crimes against humanity by the Supreme Tribunal of Poland, and he was then executed by hanging on the grounds of Auschwitz. And the last time I was there, the gallows on which he was hung were still standing, and I think they may still be standing. So that was the end of this strange man, a man without whose subordination to superior orders simply replaced his judgment. A man who went to his death after having killed millions of people, or responsible for the killing of millions, without really a problem of conscience. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. The Germans claim, the Soviets claim that 4 million people were killed at Auschwitz. Now, you say, he told me 2.5 million, another 500,000. These figures are probably too high. They're probably too high. We don't know how many people died at Auschwitz, maybe 2 million. What difference? The population of Jamestown or the population of 10 Jamestown? What's the difference? If it killed 50,000 people, that would have been enough to establish the terrible, unbelievable inhumanity of this particular man for other men. And he didn't do this alone.
What was the reaction of the press when this rolled out during the testimony at Nuremberg? I assume it was not, the press didn't have much forewarning about what the testimony was going to be. What was the reaction?
You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I'll have to look in my files and see what press clippings I have on that. The press had to take account of this. So there must be a lot in the press.
What was the conversation among the staff, the lawyers? We saw a little clip in the movies about even Jackson and some of the staff members talking about the introduction of, the fact that Kaltenbrunner's attorney had decided to bring in Hess. Was that a fairly accurate depiction of what we saw in the movie as to the reaction of the Nuremberg staff?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's pretty good.
Did the Americans have to wrestle the British at all to take the lead on interrogating or handling this?
I never had any discussion with the British counterparts. I was the guy that got him, and I got the affidavit, and we never had any problem at all. We never had any conflict. That is interesting, though. You'd think they would have turned hers over to the British. No, I know why they turned it over to, why I got him. Because we were, I was prosecuting Kaltenbrunner, and I guessed that my British counterparts just simply respected that. That's a good question. I really don't know. And I don't remember ever talking to any of the British staff, particularly about this issue, about this event.
When he was originally arrested in Britain, he was under an alias at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah, what was his name? I know the alias. He hid out as a farmer. The British had taken an affidavit from him, too. Now, I didn't get that. I had slipped up on that. I should have asked when they sent him over if they had taken any statements from him, but I forgot to do so. I was so pleased to get him, so I wanted to get from him, everything I could. I didn't even think about it, but I do have the affidavit that he gave to the British now. But it's consistent with everything he said.
And where was he captured?
Flensburg, Germany. He was hiding out as a farmer there.
And that was the British zone.
Yeah, this is the British zone.
About how much time was this interrogation process between him going on the stand as Kaufman's witness? You had him in Nuremberg for just those 3 days right before, or was it a couple of weeks?
It wasn't a very long time. You mean how long was he in Nuremberg for our total?
To be developed before he was...
I think it's only a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not positive. We can find from the records on that easily.
Then he finishes his testimony, and do you have any recollections to how soon thereafter he was shipped out to...
Yes, it was very soon after that. Because, now let me think when he got there. Let's see. He was brought to trial in March 1947, but he was held in prison in Warsaw for quite some time because he had enough time to write his memoirs. And he was encouraged to do this, of course. And he wrote his whole life history, and that has since been republished, been published, of course. And everything I say is consistent with what he said, except he's always contended that the figure of 3 million people killed was too high. He's always contended that. And he's always contended that he never personally harmed anybody, did any direct harm. Now, he admitted to me that he looked through the glass aperture into the chambers to see the people dying from prussic gas, and that he witnessed the burning of bodies in the crematories. That he all admits without any problem. But he claimed that he never did any direct harm to anyone. But we do have a statement of a witness or some statement to the effect that when they were burning bodies in the open trenches, this capo or whoever it was assigned to throw the bodies into the fire, the burning embers, But there was a baby, the body of a baby there that he hesitated to do, and that Hearst grabbed the baby by the leg and threw the baby into the flames. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That never came into the evidence at Nuremberg. But we have that type of story as to whether he was really this kind of person or not. Himmler told Hearst, Hearst, don't talk about what we're doing to anybody. And he meant it, that he was to keep everything to himself. And Hearst was asked whether he ever broke that pledge. And he said yes, he did. On one occasion, and that was to his wife. His wife had heard, They lived there on the grounds of Auschwitz. I was there and saw their house and their beautiful gardens. He lived there with his wife, and I think they had 3 children. They had help, which was a maid, which came from, of course, Auschwitz concentration camp inmates.
Great.
Sure.
I'm a professor of chemistry, and the complicity of Age Farben in the Auschwitz story has been published frequently.
Yeah.
Did Hess, I'm sorry, I call it Hess, did Hess give you any names of his contacts and people with whom he worked to change from carbon monoxide to Cyclone B?
No, he didn't. But I'll tell you, after our trial was finished, there were subsequent trials, as you know. We had American subsequent trials, and the British had some, and I think the French may have 1 or 2. As far as we know, the Russians didn't. One of the trials that the British had was interesting. They tried the head of, I can't remember the firm now in my mind. Anyway, this is the firm that manufactured Cyclone B gas. Now, what was the theory of their case? Nothing criminal to make Cyclone B gas. We got bugs all over the place. It's sold in the stores. The theory of the case against these people was that after, they got into this killing of human beings thing, the demand for Cyclone B gas exploded when Rudolf Hearst was going to kill hundreds of thousands of human beings with Cyclone B gas. He didn't need a little can of it. He needed great volumes of it. And that case took place, and these fellows, the British won the lawsuit. Amazing. I wouldn't think they were able to do so, but they did.
One other question and comment, and that is that the Germans already had in their research laboratories and manufacturing capabilities for what we now know as weapons of mass destruction and chemical weapons that have been in the news over the last 2 or 3 years. These were discovered in Germany in the 30s, so the complicity of the German chemists with the Nazi regime wasn't entire and wasn't complete, or they would have known about these things, I believe.
I think you're probably right.
Whitney, do you remember others attending or following up? Once you kind of had the sessions and developed the affidavit, did Amon start to sit in? Did other Americans have sessions, or did they observe some of your sessions with Hearst?
No. Nobody had anything to do with Rudolf Hearst except myself. Now, the affidavit is attested to by Smith Brookhart. He was with the interrogation team, and he always was the officer who attested it. My name doesn't appear on the affidavit at all, but no one else had anything to do with it. The affidavit was so complete and I mean, there wasn't any reason for anybody else to talk to him.
So then when Eamon is preparing to be the attorney who will cross-examine, did you have to brief him? I mean, you're sitting next to him when he does it.
I may have. I don't really remember. I just don't remember. But now this is an aside. This is just confidential. But it's kind of funny. This shows what happens. You know, I was a little man at Nuremberg. I was only 32 or 3 years old. I wasn't a big shot. Colonel Amon was the big shot. He was the head of the interrogation section and so on. But I had interrogated some witnesses on the stand. I introduced the first case introduced at Nuremberg, which was the case against Ernst Kaltenbrunner. I presented that case. That was the very first case against an individual defendant. So I had some contact with the courtroom, but that wasn't my job. That was Colonel Amon's job with his staff. But anyway, I became quite close friends with Tom Dodd, who became the successor executive trial counsel after Bob Story returned to the United States. And at one time, during the time we were at Nuremberg, things went on, Justice Story asked me to give him a memorandum on the organization of our staff. I don't now remember exactly what it was, but he wanted me to make some suggestions to how the staff might better be reorganized or something. So I sat down, wrote up what I thought would be good ideas, and submitted it to Justice Jackson. I did not submit it to
Dodd or Story?
Yeah, Dodd.
Okay.
I didn't submit it to Tom Dodd, who had succeeded Story at that time. And so after this whole thing with Hearst was over, and everybody, this had to be one of the most exciting part of the whole lawsuit. Dodd said, Whitney, he said, I think I'll tell you why it was that I did not give you the right to cross-examine Rudolph Hearst. Well, I said, well, I didn't expect to be given that assignment. He said, the reason is that you wrote a memorandum to Justice Jackson about reorganization of our staff, and you did not pass it through me, which you should have done. That shows how petty people could really be. Can you believe that? But I didn't care at all. I'm sure that Colonel Amon did a better job of cross-examination than I could have done, so it didn't matter.
Do you remember anything about how the Hearst admissions were brought to Jackson's attention?
No. I don't have any idea.
Okay. Well, in the day when Hearst is testifying, after Amon cross-examines, the Russian prosecutor seeks an opportunity, and the tribunal stops him and said, our procedure is one nation cross-examines each witness. The Americans have already done this. They ask for a proffer. He says he wants to develop evidence about crimes against the Soviet people, and the tribunal denies him the opportunity to question. And that becomes a big stink after the session among the chief prosecutors. Rudenko calls a meeting. And,
I didn't know that.
And Jackson's part of all that, about how the tribunal has stopped the Russians from questioning Hess.
Well, I think, you see, I don't know anything about that.
Okay,
That's
I was
very
wondering if you
interesting.
were in that meeting.
But of course, I sympathize with the Russians. because the first people killed at a mass extermination of people at Auschwitz were Soviet prisoners of war. They were the first. And I think maybe that the tribunal made a mistake there, not to let the Russians cross-examine Hirsch on that. But that's interesting to me. I did not know that. What do you know about that? Where'd you get that information?
Notes of that chief prosecutor's meeting. On that Monday night, after the trial's over, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the prosecutors had one of their late afternoon meetings. And it was basically for the Soviets to rail against the tribunal, and nobody did anything about it other than gave them a chance to complain.
No, I didn't know. That's very interesting. I never know that.
As you look at this Ray Diodario photo, the one that didn't transcribe very well in the picture,
Yeah.
what's your reaction? I mean, you've been telling us about the story, but you look at the individual, Rudolf Hirsch, and there he is in color. What sense of emotion does a Whitney Harris have?
Well, what does he look like? He does not look like a Nazi exterminator. If I were going to picture in my mind a man who represented Germany in the killing of 2 million people, I would think of somebody, a big, tall guy, broad shoulders, stern appearance, strong, and so on. This Rudolf Hirsch looks like a grocery clerk, and that's the opinion that I had of him at the time. Quiet-voiced, non-aggressive, unbelievable. And yet he was the one in charge. That's Hirsch. That's him. He was not defiant in the slightest. A very easy person to interrogate, mainly because he told the truth. And that was somewhat characteristic of German witnesses. They could have given us a very much harder time than we had if they had simply denied death. You take Otto Ollendorf. Why did he tell me they killed 90,000 people? He didn't have to say that. He said, well, I really don't remember that. There was some people killed, I don't know. I'll pass it off. Where would I have found the evidence? But when somebody tells you, we killed 90,000 people in 1 year, he becomes your witness, as you know. From then on, there's no point in him hiding anything. The same way what he told me had to be the truth.
If I may be permitted from the peanut gallery,
Sure.
I'd like to ask why you think these people may have told you the truth. Was there an immunity deal? Were there, heavy-handed tactics by MPs or anything like those we've heard about?
No. What advantage would he have to tell me, that they murdered 2 million people if it were not the truth?
Right. But why would he say it?
That's it. Why would he say it? Very good. That's a question I ask myself over and over again. They just answered truthfully. They just said what it was. Maybe because a fellow like Hirsch is, you see, he's is a victim of authoritarianism. Why did he carry this out? He says, I believe what Himmler told me. This is the evil of a dictatorship. The Fuhrer says this, I have to believe what he says. he says it to the next man. I have to believe what he says. So Himmler tells me that the Jews are going to destroy Germany if we lose the war. I believed it. And he said, that's my belief. He told me time and again. No problem. I believe that.
Did he know he was putting his neck in a noose by saying that?
That's the other side of it. They must know. That's the amazing thing about it. It's really amazing. Yeah.
Any psychological profile done on us?
Now, you see, he has his defense now. Watch out. He does have a defense. Superior orders.
Yeah.
He said, I didn't do anything on my own. I never harmed a soul. Heinrich Himmler told me we had to establish this extermination center because the Jews were going to destroy Germany if we lost the war. He told me to do this. I'm only carrying out his orders. I'm a small man. And I didn't kill anybody personally. I didn't do anything, he could separate that in his mind. So that's his defense. Now, I suppose that Otto Ohlendorf would have taken the same line. He didn't set up the Einsatzgruppen. He didn't do that. But he was assigned as to be chief of Einsatzgruppe D for 1941. Well, this is the war. He has to do what he's told to do. So he did it. Is that a crime? And it all goes back to Adolf Hitler. So we kill Adolf Hitler, and everybody else goes free under their reasoning.
Do you remember anything about the defendants' reactions as they sit there and hear Hearst giving these answers?
No, I don't remember, but I know they must have been appalled. Appalled not because of the fact that this happened, but they could see the end for them to be. That's why when we put the film, see, that had such a profound effect. The defendants were, they were getting along. They thought they were doing all right, nothing too terrible. Then they put the film in, and they could see now what really happened. And they see these starved bodies, concentration camps, and being put into anti-tank ditches by earth-moving machinery and so on. They knew the jig was up then. Somebody's going to have to answer for this kind of murder and slaughter.
What about the judges? I've noticed in the transcript, it's one of the examinations where Lawrence really seems to demonstrate his disgust or his outrage, and it's also one of the occasions where Biddle directly questions a witness. He questions Hearst a little bit about the labor camps, and it seems to have really struck the bench in a particularly direct way. Do you remember noticing any of that?
Oh no, I don't remember. I remember one time when the bench was affected. That was what's his name? I'll think about it in a minute.